In the novel Morning's Light, Naomi, a resilient and independent woman, cherishes the serenity of dawn on her farm, where she single-handedly cultivates organic produce cherished by both humans and the inhabitants of Wolf Mountain Village. Despite the challenges of solitude and the physical demands of farm life, Naomi finds solace and purpose in her work, often waking early to tend to her chickens and prepare for the weekly market at Ben James General Store. The narrative takes a dramatic turn when Naomi is unexpectedly abducted and held captive, her captor, John, revealing a complex character torn between duty and a growing admiration for Naomi's tenacity and intelligence. Naomi, imprisoned in a cold room, uses her wit to try and uncover information about her situation and John's motives, sensing a divide between him and the more sinister figures orchestrating her captivity. John, grappling with his conscience and the threat posed by his employer Dimitri, supplies Naomi with distractions like books, acknowledging her strength in the face of adversity. He becomes increasingly intrigued by her, noticing her humor and intelligence, while simultaneously feeling uneasy about the bond forming amidst their captivity context. Meanwhile, Naomi experiences vivid dreams and memories of her past, including her family home, which trigger a deep-rooted fear and urgency to escape. These recollections interweave with the present-day tension, highlighting Naomi's determination to understand and overcome her ordeal. Parallel to Naomi's plight, characters like Allie and Ben embark on a desperate search for Naomi, navigating the complexities of their own relationships and the dangers lurking within their community. Allie's hunches lead her to consider seeking help from a potentially unstable source, her father, igniting debates about responsibility and the consequences of involving him. The novel weaves themes of survival, unlikely alliances, and the resilience of the human spirit against a backdrop of mystery and danger. Naomi's journey reflects not only her personal battle for freedom, but also a broader exploration of trust, loyalty, and the hidden depths of seemingly ordinary lives. Morning's Light ultimately poses questions about the true nature of good and evil, and the blurred lines that separate them when survival instincts collide with moral choices. Chapter 1. Naomi. Mornings were Naomi's favorite time of day, especially when it started to get cold. She stood on the front porch tying her bootlaces, feeling the early morning breezes that were no longer laden with the comforting warmth of summer. The trees in the yard swayed gently in the wind. The sunrise hadn't reached the farm yet. The house was still plunged in the gray-white darkness of the early morning. Her bedroom had still been dark when she'd woken up, the bed warm and comfortable, encouraging her to sink further into the feathery comfort. But working on a farm alone, even when she was stronger than a human woman, was not easy. She couldn't lose precious time lying around in bed when she had to be up and about. It wasn't the easiest life, but she loved it. Still, she had to wonder if there wasn't some merit to the idea of staying in bed for a morning. But what was done, and now that she was up and ready, she wrapped her scarf around her neck as many times as she could and sank her face into the burgundy wool. Everything was still, the silence punctuated only by the quiet chirping of the early birds. Naomi trudged out to the chicken coop. The chickens weren't happy at being stirred from their warm beds this early, especially not by someone with such cold hands, but thankfully they were quiet. She wouldn't normally be collecting the eggs and doing the feeding this early, but it was market day, and she had to take her latest harvest to Ben James General Store in Fell, the village that was also known as Wolf Mountain. The store was still her best customer, though there were also people who came out to her farm to buy vegetables and fruits and things directly from her. It wasn't just the wolves. Humans from the towns around them came to her for her produce as well. A woman running her own farm and selling organic produce was a selling point. Nowadays, Ben treated her pretty well. He paid her a fair price for her produce. Of course, much of that was down to Allie, Ben's fiancée and Naomi's lifelong best friend. Ben and Naomi hadn't started off liking each other, but they'd managed to reach a state of détente after everything that happened last year. She couldn't really justify her distaste for the guy after he'd risked his life to save Allie, so she settled for just sniping at him when Allie couldn't hear it. It was their own version of a friendship, but she'd come to value it. Naomi got through her chores as quickly as she could. The farm wasn't the biggest, but she had chickens, a couple of cows, and some sheep. She had fields planted with seasonal vegetables and fruit trees. She'd even put in some flowers, which a lot of the women in the village seemed to like. The life Naomi was living wasn't one she'd ever thought she'd have. Growing up with the Sanguine Pack, she'd been a bit of a rebel, going out to parties after curfew and flouting the rules her parents set for their only child. Someone had told that girl she'd one day become a farmer, living with the fell pack no less. She'd have laughed before just walking away. As a werewolf, going to live with a rival pack was almost unheard of. Even so, after the rivalry between the two packs exploded into kidnapping and attempted murder, staying became unbearable. Even shifting during the full moon was different out here in Fell. The air smelled crisper to her heightened senses than it had in Sanguine. Back in Sanguine, she'd have to contain herself during the full moon, shackle herself, lest she embarrass her family. Here in Fell she could howl and shout and run, without worrying. It was rawer than anything she'd ever experienced. After the first full moon she'd experienced in Fell, she had sobbed out of happiness, the tears cutting tracks through the mud on her face. Afterwards, she'd met up with Allie at the diner in town. "It's a bit of a rush, isn't it?" Allie had asked. "Your first really free shift." "It was amazing," Naomi had said. "Is the air different here? Is it cleaner or something? Because it smells different." Allie had grinned at her friend. "I think that's just the sweet smell of freedom, nay. Plus I think they're bigger on the whole environmental responsibility thing here than they are back home, so the air might literally be cleaner." Naomi had giggled. "It's great here. I'm glad you strong-armed me into moving up." Excuse me? We just mentioned it to you offhand, and you came with us," quipped Allie. She had reached over the table and patted her friend's hand. "But to be honest, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you did." Naomi had nodded. "You best be, especially since I saved your life while your useless fiancé tagged along." Back in the present, Naomi heaved a content sigh. Yes, it wasn't a life she'd ever thought she'd have, but it was a really good one. She finally got her truck loaded up with eggs, vegetables, and fruits for the store and got on the road. She had gotten up early enough that she'd be getting there as soon as the store opened. The drive was beautiful. That was the only way to describe it. Driving the heavy truck she used for her farm chores required her to be careful, so she couldn't barrel down the road the way she could when she had her old roadster. Her driving style had practically become a trademark of hers among the people she knew. Allie used to tell her she drove like the devil was on her tail. Naomi had sold her old car when she bought the farm, but she still missed it. She made her way through the mountain roads that surrounded Fell, the trees still clinging onto the bright green hue of midsummer. It was one of her favorite parts of the area. In Sanguine, everything seemed a little heavier than it did here. It was probably the novelty of living here that made her feel this way. The town was just waking up when she drove into it. People recognized her truck, and one person even waved to her as she drove. Naomi waved back. Politeness was the best policy for a newcomer to the village. Allie fit into the community like a hand into a custom-made glove once she moved here with Ben. She'd always been gregarious and outgoing, and people liked her right away, especially with one of their own to vouch for her. But they'd been distrustful of Naomi. The fight to get Allie back had landed. Naomi with a faint scar on her face, lancing from the bottom of her right jaw up to her nose, which, to quote Ben, made her look shifty. After he said that, Naomi had waited until Allie wasn't looking to smack him across the back of the head. People in town seemed distrustful of the solitary wolf who lived by herself on a farm. The whispers and stares hadn't stopped for a good 2 months until Rex Blake, the alpha of the Fell Pack, had made an effort to be seen with Naomi around town. It was a natural instinct in some wolves. Once their leader approved of someone, they did too. There were a few holdouts, of course, but now, for the most part, everyone had lapsed into polite indifference. She didn't blame them for their initial distrust. She hadn't become a full member of the Fell Pack. Rex had offered her the chance when she first came to Fell, but after everything that had happened, she felt like she needed some space first. Rex didn't like that, but he was gracious enough to facilitate her purchase of the farm. "He likes you, you know," Allie told her one day on the farm. "He thinks you're feisty." Naomi had been taking a sip of iced tea, and she almost choked. "Feisty? Who says feisty anymore?" Allie laughed. "I think he's been spending too much time with the elders. He started speaking like an old man. I mean, I get why he wants me to officially be a part of the Fell Pack, but I get it, Nay. I really do. You need some time to be on your own." Naomi had nodded. After everything that happened back home and with my family, I think I just need to figure out who I am outside of all of that. And the farm had been just the thing she needed. Her life in Sanguine had been a soup of conflict and confusion. Her family was not one of the most stable in the town. They had moved to Sanguine from Florida, which in itself had made them outcasts in town for a good while. Her father hadn't really cared, so Naomi and her brother had been left to fend for themselves. She'd never felt as isolated as she had in Sanguine, not even in her first few days in Fell. When she had first started supplying her produce to the general store in Fell, the sentiment towards her in the town had considerably warmed. People couldn't hate the person who supplied them with fresh eggs and flowers all the time, could they? Naomi arrived in town, turned into the parking lot of the store, and drove the truck right up to the back of the store. It didn't have much of a loading dock, but there was a back room that they used for storage. She honked her horn hard a few times until Ben came outside with a clipboard. "Hey, why are you making so much noise? We're right here. We can hear you." "Weirdo," he said with a wink. "Oh, shut up and help me unload all this stuff," Naomi replied, leaping out of the cab of the truck and opening the tail. "Where's Allie?" "What, you don't even say good morning? I thought you finally loved me," said Ben as he came around the side of the truck. He started taking boxes out of the back of the truck, but not before ruffling Naomi's hair. She rolled her eyes, but she couldn't help but smile. Ben really wasn't that bad, and sometimes he could even be funny when he wasn't trying so hard. "Good morning," she said. "Now hurry up with the unloading. I'm a farmer. I'm the backbone of the economy. I don't have to wait around for you to finish moving slowly. Please, we all know you're going to go back home now and drink iced tea on your porch and do absolutely nothing lazy." They kept bickering back and forth while unloading the truck together. Once everything was unloaded and put away in the storage room, they put the crates and boxes back into Naomi's truck. She liked to reuse as much as she could. Plus it made it easier that she didn't have to come back into town for boxes every time she needed to pack something away. "Come in and have some coffee while I make up your receipt," said Ben. He led her to the office at the back of the store and poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the sideboard. When Allie had come to live with Ben and started helping out at the store, the office had been expanded into a suite with some couches and chairs for guests. Naomi wouldn't ever tell Ben, but she liked hanging out in here. She sipped her coffee and grimaced. It was hot, but that was the best that could be said about it. "I didn't know we were serving mud from ditches as coffee now," she said as she placed the mug on Ben's desk. Ben rolled his eyes. "Drink it or don't, but don't cast aspersions toward the quality of my coffee. Maybe if you gave me real coffee I wouldn't have to." "So where's Allie?" Naomi asked. Ben put a hand to his forehead, pantomiming injury. "You're hurting me, you." "No. Don't you like hanging out with me?" "Not even a little. I come around here to get paid, you know that," Naomi answered, but she gave Ben a smile and a wink. They lapsed into silence as Ben typed up her receipt and printed it out. "How's everything going?" she asked. "Well, thank you for asking like a normal, polite person," said Ben, smirking. "Everything's good. Allie's busy planning the wedding and Rex asked me to take a more active role in the pack, so I've been kind of running around, trying to keep my head above water. How's everything with you?" But before Naomi could answer, she heard someone saying, "Hey, Naomi smiled and turned towards the door to see Allie standing there. Allie pushed her sunglasses up onto her head and smiled at both of them. "Hey, LS," said Naomi. Allie jogged around the desk and kissed Ben hello, before she came around the other side and hugged her friend. "Nay, you look good," she said. "I know. I've been having a great few weeks," replied Naomi. She patted Allie on the back. "You look like an old married lady already. I'm so proud." "She looks perfect, woman," said Ben. Naomi discreetly stuck her tongue out at him before turning back to Allie. "How are the wedding plans going?" Allie huffed. "They're going. Everything is turning into a battle with the parents of someone who shall remain nameless." She jabbed a finger towards Ben. Naomi snickered. Allie had told her about her clashes with Ben's mother over the menu for the wedding, the number of guests, and even the flowers. The wedding date was 3 months away. But as much as Ben's mother was getting on Allie's nerves, at least she was involved. The same could not be said about Allie's parents in Sanguine. Unfortunately, they had made it very clear that They didn't want to have anything to do with their only child's wedding. Naomi knew how much it saddened Allie. Even after everything that had happened, even after Allie's parents had tried to force her into marriage with a psychotic wolf and tried to kill Ben, some small part of her had been hoping for a reconciliation, that they'd understand what they'd done wrong and apologize. Naomi knew that it wasn't going to happen, and Allie knew it too, but hope was a powerful thing. Fortunately, Ben had managed to cheer Allie up. They were childhood sweethearts, having met when Ben ran away to Sanguine from Fell as a teenager. Naomi had had a front row seat to their courtship, and the heartbreak that Allie had gone through when Ben went back home had been agony, even to Naomi. She'd also been there the night Ben and Allie met again, as adults at a club. Back in the present, there was a sudden knock at the door of the store's office. Rex, Ben said in surprise. The alpha of the Fell pack rarely came into town to do his own shopping these days. Ben stood back to let Rex into the room. Rex Blake had been the alpha of the Fell pack for nearly 10 years now. By all counts, he was a great leader. He'd changed some of the leadership mechanisms of the pack to make it more equitable so that the wolves had a bigger say in how the pack was run. Ben had told Naomi once that the elders had objected to it, but that they had eventually surrendered out of respect for their leader. Rex shook Ben's hand and came into the office. "Ah, nice. Everyone's here," he said, with a jolly twinkle in his eye. Since he'd grown a beard a few months ago, Naomi thought he was only a few years from looking like Santa Claus in a designer suit. Even so, her habitual respect for authority figures in the pack made her stand and wait until Rex had sat down before she took her seat. "How are you, Naomi?" Rex asked. He wasn't nearly as formal as the other alphas she'd met, but she still couldn't make herself relax around him. Seemed rude to treat a man in that position as she would her friend. She smiled politely. "I'm fine, thank you. Everything's great on the farm, too." "That's great," Rex said. "That reminds me, I need to buy some flowers for the missus. Yours are the only flowers she's never found fault with." Naomi chuckled. "I'll make sure to fix her a really nice bouquet." She appreciated Rex's efforts to make her feel comfortable. He had a knack for reading people, and he had seemed to catch on to the fact that Naomi was a little reserved right away. Instead of pushing her to get involved in the pack, he was patient, polite, and kind, letting her go at her own pace. Even she was surprised at how much that had touched her. Rex nudged her. "I hope you've been thinking about my proposal to officially join us," he said. "There's a space in the pack all nice and picked out for you when you're ready." Naomi smiled at him appreciatively. "I have been thinking about it, really. I'll let you know if I change my mind." Rex nodded and stood up with a grunt. "All right, ladies, I hope you forgive me, but I'm going to have to steal Ben from you for a few minutes." "Keep him," mumbled Naomi. It didn't seem like anyone heard her, and she swallowed a chuckle. The two men went out into the main floor of the store, leaving Naomi and Allie alone. "What do you think they're talking about?" asked Naomi. Allie shrugged. "Everything's been quiet lately. I don't know. Probably some pack business." Her face dropped a little as she spoke. "What's wrong, ALS?" "Nothing," Allie said with a sigh. "I heard some of the elders talking the other day is all. They were saying that nothing has been coming out of Sanguine. It's just quiet." "Isn't that a good thing?" asked Naomi. Allie's expression wasn't one of relief, but trepidation. "I guess it's a good thing. I just doubt that my father is quiet for this long without reason." Andre Galkin, Allie's father, had been elected the alpha of the Sanguine pack, succeeding Nicholas Vedenen. The Sanguine pack hadn't had much luck with alphas, and Nicholas was no different. He was power-hungry and calculating, and he and Andre had been part of a scheme to take over the surrounding packs. It almost got Allie, Naomi, and Ben killed. Naomi squeezed Allie's hand. "Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow, honey," she said. Allie looked confused, and Naomi shrugged. "My mom used to say that to me. Just mean you shouldn't worry when we don't even know if there's anything to worry about. Your dad is not a stupid man, and he won't go looking for trouble. While the Sanguines are so weakened, everything's going to be fine, I promise." Allie sighed, then nodded. "You're right, Nay. There's no reason to think that he's up to something. I should just relax and let it go. Whatever Ben and Rex are talking about is probably really boring." "Exactly," Naomi exclaimed. "Your wedding is coming up and everything's going to be great." But even as Naomi spoke, Paranoia started to well up in her head. It was true that Andre wasn't a stupid man, but it was also true that he was a proud man. If he felt he'd been humiliated by his daughter and her allies, he might want to get his revenge. Naomi shook her head to push the suspicion away and repeated to herself, "Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow." Chapter 2. John. A forest in October was definitely a good place to hold a meeting that needed to remain secret. John's skin prickled as the icy wind whipped past his face, but he knew better than to move to try and get warm. He kept his position, standing at attention watching his boss Dimitri smoke one cigarette after another as they waited. Andre Galkin, the newest alpha of the Sanguine pack, had insisted on meeting at a location that was far away from prying eyes. It was not unusual for people seeking a meeting with one of the most feared enforcers in the country. It wouldn't do for respected members and elders to be seen consorting with someone like Dmitry Chernov. They stood in a secluded clearing in the dense forest that rested just outside the town limits of Sanguine. The trees around them stood in the heavy darkness, like silent sentinels, bending ever so slightly with the push and pull of the wind. John had already checked the perimeter of the clearing once yesterday and once just after they arrived. Some in Dimitri's employ thought that this was a symptom of the paranoia that Dimitri had instilled in the young man. John preferred to think of himself as just extremely thorough, although he couldn't deny that Dimitri had more than just a passing influence on the way he was acting when they were out together. Whatever it was, he wasn't about to let his first big job with Dimitri go awry because he hadn't paid attention. Dimitri always insisted on coming early to meetings. John had plucked up the courage to ask why once many years ago. The first rule was always to not question Dimitri, and John had shaken in his boots, wondering whether his temperamental boss was going to punish him for the insubordination. But Dimitri had just chuckled and patted the young man on the back. "It's always good to be prepared, puppy. Get there early, get to understand the lay of the land, know where an ambush might come from. You can never regain the advantage. You lose by being lazy." The words had echoed in John's mind as he carried out his checks, but he had to admit that it was irritating to have to stand around in the freezing cold and wait for a man who traveled on his own whims. It was well known that Andre came to meetings whenever he felt like it. The legendary discipline he expected and displayed when he was just a businessman had flown out the window when he got in charge of the pack. Dmitry Chernov wasn't the most well-known wolf in the country, and he liked that way. He was a man people contacted when they wanted to get things done. His contact information was only available on a need-to-know basis to those who could pay handsomely for the privilege. He also didn't take jobs that didn't interest him. "I'm not some garden variety hitman," he told John once. "If there's no fun in it, why would I waste my time?" Dimitri's background was shrouded in mystery, but whether that was because he wanted it that way or because no one was brave enough to ask, John didn't know. Ostensibly, he belonged to the Sanguine pack and had since birth, but Dimitri was not one to pledge loyalty to any one person, so he went where he was wanted, doing the jobs that no one else had the skills or the stomach for, and raked in money as he did. John had started working for Dimitri as a young boy. Well, working might not be the right word for it. The arrangement was based more on an understanding between John's family and Dimitri than on an employer-employee relationship. John had heard the details of the arrangement over the years, but he didn't like to dwell on it. Painful memories were just a chink in the armor he'd managed to build for himself over the years. Working for a man like Dimitri meant that one couldn't very well stay the same person one had always been. Dimitri didn't accept any kind of insubordination from his people. John learned that the hard way when he first started working with Dimitri. Punishments ranged from cleaning the floor of the woodshed with a toothbrush and dish soap to more old-world punishments like kneeling on the ground with your arms sticking straight out until every muscle in your back and arms was burning. But John had always been a disciplined person, even as a child, and he learned quickly what he could and couldn't do. Dimitri had come to trust the young boy. John rose quickly through the ranks of Dimitri's group of selected lieutenants. It wasn't a very big group, but everyone in it was absolutely loyal to Dimitri. Still, they questioned why John, the youngest member of the team, had been promoted to a position of such trust so quickly. "I know things about people," Dimitri had told John once by way of explanation. "I had a good feeling about you from the beginning. You'd never Let me down, would you? And Dmitri was right. For all the difficulties involved in living with and working for a man who was an enforcer, fixer, or bounty hunter for the rich, Dmitri was the first stable adult figure in John's life, and he couldn't help the loyalty he felt for him, even when Dmitri's disciplinary measures were tough or painful. There was still no sign of Andrei, standing in the clearing, staring up at the silent trees and their stretching shadows was making John uncomfortable. He tried to ignore the irritation building in his chest. It wasn't his business to ask questions. He was here to make sure Dmitri made it out of this meeting in one piece. His boss noticed his agitation. John, dear boy, you mustn't get yourself too worked up, Dmitri said. His voice was rough with nicotine and a lilt that hinted at a childhood somewhere exotic and far away. The old man isn't clever enough to do anything crazy to us, I promise. Nothing is lurking in the shadows. Dmitri leaned back against the tree behind him and blew a perfectly straight plume of cigarette smoke into the air. John nodded, annoyed with himself for giving away his thoughts. It was one of the first things Dmitri had taught him. Never let anyone know what you are thinking. It creates weakness. The sound of a car speeding in the distance filtered through the canopy of leaves to the clearing where the two men were standing, and almost in the same instance, headlights appeared in the distance. John drew himself up to his full height, while Dmitri snuffed his cigarette on the ground. A black SUV, shining even in the dark, pulled up near the clearing, and a young-looking wolf hopped out of the driver's seat and jogged to the opposite side to open the back door for Andrei. John had not yet met the new alpha in person. Andrei was a distinguished-looking man, tall and composed. He still bore some of the scars from the fight with the fell wolves some time ago. The exact cause of the conflict hadn't been disclosed to the members of the pack. Information was at a premium in Sanguine. The elders believed in keeping pack business private, so when Andrei's daughter Alexandra went missing, the rumor mill went into overdrive. Some said the fell pack had kidnapped and brainwashed her, and there was even talk of an all-out war between the two packs. But without official confirmation, everything was just that talk. John watched as the alpha surveyed his surroundings, taking in Dmitri, who was still leaning nonchalantly against the tree, and the young wolf, who was standing at attention near his boss. And then he broke into a smile. Dmitri, how are you, old friend? He asked, advancing on Dmitri with an extended hand. The young wolf he'd come with stayed by the car, his eyes just as watchful as John's as their bosses shook hands in the center of the clearing. Well, I can't complain, Andrei, said Dmitri with a shrug, releasing the alpha's hand. It's always good to work, isn't it? That it is, my friend. Andrei clapped Dmitri on the back. Now why don't you tell me what you need me for, Andrei? The level of familiarity with which Dmitri addressed the alpha was surprising to John, but he tried not to let it show. Instead, he just watched and observed like a good soldier should. That was also one of the first lessons Dmitri taught him. I think you may know about the difficulties that my family has faced in the last year or so, said Andrei. All pretense of friendship and camaraderie had disappeared, and both men were acting distinctly businesslike. Yes, I was sorry to hear about that, Dmitri replied. None of what they were saying was making any sense to John, but he supposed it didn't have to, even if he was curious to know if the rumors about Alexandra's disappearance were true. Well, I had a simple idea. Nothing complicated. Thought you would be the perfect person to help me make it a reality, said Andrei. Dmitri stood still, watching the alpha carefully. Now that he was closer, John could see that he wasn't nearly as put together as he'd first appeared. His suit was slightly rumpled, strands of hair were sticking out around his face, and his eyes were blazing, giving him a slightly manic look. This was a man who'd been in a difficult position for a long time, and he was starting to show it. John turned his eyes away. He didn't want to alert them to the fact that he was curious beyond the bounds of his job. Tell me what you have in mind, and if I find it interesting, we can work something out, said Dmitri. He reached into his pocket for another cigarette, popped it into his mouth, and lit it, all in one smooth movement. He looked for all the world like a man catching up with a friend in a bar. What I want is something that requires delicacy, Dmitri. Cannot just be rushed into. Andrei, please stop beating about the bush and tell me what's on your mind. Andre cast a glance at the young man who had come in the car with him and dismissed him with a slight wave. The man nodded and jumped back into the car, making sure the windows were rolled all the way up. Then Andre turned to John. Perhaps it would be better to discuss this in private, Dimitri, he said. Dimitri shook his head. John has been with me for many years. You do not need to worry about his discretion. He might as well be one of the trees around us. Isn't that right, John? John knew better than to answer. He kept his gaze fixed on the trees in front of him, trying to hear any sounds beyond the regular noises of a forest at night. Dimitri was right. John was not a man to stick his nose where it wasn't wanted. Of course he wasn't perfect. He wanted to know the things his boss talked about with the people who hired him, but it wasn't his place to do anything but protect his boss, and he was comfortable with that. Andre glared at John for a few seconds more before turning his attention back to Dimitri. I'll trust you, Dimitri, he said. Just be aware that this is a very sensitive subject. Dimitri simply blew another plume of cigarette smoke from his mouth and waited for Andre to say what he wanted to say. I think perhaps I should be honest with you about the difficulties my family has been facing, Andre began. He paced around the clearing as he spoke, obviously agitated. His leather-gloved hands ran through his hair over and over, giving him an even more rumpled look. My daughter was not taken to Fell by force, although I'm not sure there was no brainwashing going on, he said. She is planning to marry one of the wolves from that pack, Benjamin James. He came to our pack when they were teenagers, and I thought I put a stop to it, but evidently they have been communicating behind my back for all these years. She ran off and she joined that traitor Rex Blake. John could smell the rage coming off the man in waves. Dimitri didn't move a muscle. My family has been dishonored more than I ever thought possible. My daughter is dead to me now, he continued. I'm sorry to hear that, but what can I do about it, my friend? I cannot bring her back here. It would violate every rule of nature. She has chosen her pack. Dimitri waved his hands, the bright tip of the cigarette cutting through the air. Let it go. My concern is not my daughter. She is gone, and my wife and I have come to accept that. Andre hesitated before he went on. She has a friend, Naomi Grimes. She left the pack in disgrace like the dog she is after what happened with Alexandra. She's living on her own now. I have a source inside Fell who tells me she has refused to join their pack. John noticed Dimitri stiffen slightly. No one else would have noticed it, but he'd been with Dimitri for long enough that the difference was glaring to him. And what does this girl matter to you? Dimitri asked Andre. You're an alpha. She's nobody. She took everything from me. I told Alexandra when they were children that bitch was no good. She came from Florida, you know. No discipline there. They let their children run around any way they like. Andre was ranting. He looked like he was a million miles away from the forest as he was talking. They don't understand any tradition or respect out there. She helped my daughter run off with that mutt. She attacked me. She attacked my family and turned tail and ran like a coward. And you think that you might lose face because of this? I cannot have this getting out, Andre shouted. It's bad enough that she tore my family apart, but I will not have one of my wolves living as a loner in another village. I won't have it. She has challenged my authority for the last time. John hoped to all that was holy that his face was not showing any surprise, because Dimitri would make sure he paid for it, but he couldn't help but feel that the man's behavior was strange. Andre Galkin had cultivated a reputation around Sanguine as someone cool and calculating, a contrast to the village's history of angry, volatile alphas. He seemed like the perfect person to replace Nicholas Vedinin, the previous alpha, who started to turn the line of sanguine alphas from their bloodthirsty, raging ways. But looking at him now, Andre didn't look like the man he used to be. The tendons in his neck were standing at attention. His skin flushed an angry red, which was noticeable even in the dark. He looked about 5 seconds from shifting into his wolf form and tearing them apart. But Dimitri didn't look bothered by any of it. You are making a bigger deal of this than it actually is, Andre. Dimitri leaned nonchalantly against a nearby tree, calmly smoking. Let it go. It's not worth your time. There. Gone. He made a flourish with his hands. It's done. Everyone's too afraid of you to care about rumors anyway. Andrei Galkin was not a man used to being questioned. He suppressed an audible growl in his throat and stepped closer towards Dmitri, getting right up in his face. I want you to go there, bring her to me and make her pay, he roared. Dmitri smirked. From what John had heard, Dmitri had never been one to get rattled by threats of any kind, and it looked like he wasn't about to start. Now, Dmitri dropped the stub of his cigarette to the ground and ground it out with his shoe. Well, what the alpha wants, the alpha gets, he said. I'll get her for you. Do you have somewhere to take her? Or do you want me to just finish it there? Andrei stepped back and took a deep breath. He patted his hair back into place with one hand while the other hand was still clenched. I want her brought here. I want to make an example of her. I do not want her infecting the rest of my pack. Find her and bring her to me. Dmitri shrugged. Fine. I'll take the job. He reached his hand out to shake Andrei's. We'll discuss payment later. Andrei took Dmitri's hand and shook it, still breathing hard from his outburst. I will contact you with the details about where she is and where you are to take her. You have people you can trust with this. Dmitri glanced at John with the same relaxed smile on his face. My people are beyond reproach, Andrei. Don't worry about anything. We'll get it done. We always do. Andrei nodded and reached into the inside pocket of his coat, withdrawing a thick envelope and handing it to Dmitri. Consider this a signing bonus. We'll talk about the rest of your fee once you've looked over the rest of the plans. I've put some information in there as well. Pleased doing business with you, said Dmitri. He handed the envelope to John, who put it into his inside pocket and adjusted his stance. He could feel that there was a good wad of money in there. Andrei turned on his heel and strode back to his waiting car. Well, pup, I suppose we have our work cut out for us, don't we? Dmitri said. John silently nodded and followed his boss back to the car. He tried to stay calm even though his mind was reeling. Andrei was talking about kidnapping, possibly torturing and killing someone. Doubt hit him like a tsunami, but he tried to ignore it. It wasn't his place to question. Chapter 3 Naomi. The moment Naomi woke up in the morning, she knew it was going to be one of those days. The water heater wasn't working, so she had to take a cold shower. Afterwards, she made herself some coffee, which for some reason tasted terrible. On top of that, it had rained all night, which meant that she slipped in the mud as soon as she walked out. The animals were in rare form that morning. The chickens pecked at her hands like they were trying to draw blood, and the sheep were even more recalcitrant than they used to be. There was a woman in town who liked to make her own yarn, and she was Naomi's biggest customer whenever she sheared the sheep. If it wasn't for her, I'd get rid of all of you fuzzballs, she cursed at the sheep as she cleaned out the barn. By the time Naomi had finished taking care of the animals, she was in a foul mood. Everything felt raw. Her senses were on high alert, her clothes felt unbelievably heavy, and it felt like every hair on her body was standing on end. She didn't get in moods like that very often, and it was a sure sign that something was bothering her. Wolves were normally more intuitive and perceptive than humans, and from time to time when something was on her mind, she would sink into a state where her senses were as sharp as they were during the full moon. It was insanely uncomfortable, and she knew from experience that it wouldn't go away until she figured out what was the matter. Ever since she'd seen Rex at the general store, something had been bothering her. On the surface, there was nothing to make her uncomfortable, so she had tried to take the advice she'd given Allie to let it go. Still, ever since she'd come home, she'd been feeling off. She had tried to distract herself with chores around the house, washing every dish she'd let build up in the sink, changing the shelf paper in the pantry, and rearranging all her cans. It hadn't worked. There was something lingering in the back of her mind like a specter, and she couldn't figure out what it was. It had been the same ever since she was a little girl. Every so often she'd get into a mood and refuse to play with her toys or help her mother in the kitchen, preferring to stay in her room, curled up in a corner until her senses weren't so wired. Her father had not been understanding about it, even when she tried to explain to him that when she was in a snit, as her mother put it, the world felt too heavy. Sounds, smells, and every other sensory input made her want to scream. It was around noon when Naomi finally decided to give up on trying to fix whatever it was and stomped back inside from the field. Sometimes the best way To get rid of a bad mood was to indulge it. She sat on the couch with a steaming mug of hot chocolate and her favorite chips and watched 5 episodes of her favorite television show. Finally, slowly, some of the edges came off her emotions. Her clothes felt normal again, and she felt the tension flooding out of her body. She reached for her phone and called Allie. She needed some distraction from her own thoughts. Hey ALS. Naomi tried to sound cheerful. Hey Nay. What's going on? Naomi noticed that Allie didn't sound like she normally did on the phone, and she was instantly back into her worried state of mind. Nothing. What are you up to? Everything going okay? Yeah. You know, wedding plans and everything. Naomi frowned. There was something in Allie's voice that raised her hackles. Are you sure everything's okay? You don't sound like yourself. Yeah, everything's good. Allie paused. Just something Ben told me yesterday. Naomi groaned. What did Ben say? And follow-up question, do I need to kick his butt for it? Allie giggled. Nobody's butt needs to be kicked, she said. And I think you should examine why that's your first instinct when dealing with people. Just tell me what he said. You know I can't resist gossip, replied Naomi. It's nothing. Just, do you remember when Ben and Rex were talking the other day? It was yesterday ALS. I'd be worried if I didn't remember. Yeah. Well, Ben said that Rex is worried, even though there's nothing coming out of Sanguine. Apparently, some of his contacts in some other packs are saying that my dad's been looking to hire some guy, like a hatchet man. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. What do you mean a hatchet man? Well, they were saying that this guy is the one the Sanguines call when they want something done but don't want to get their own hands dirty. If you're rich enough and powerful enough, the guy will basically do whatever for you. Did Ben tell you a name? Asked Naomi. She couldn't put a finger on it, but at that moment the most important thing in the world seemed to be knowing who exactly this man was. The specter in the back of her mind was growing larger and blacker, clouding the rest of her thoughts. Nah, he's not really supposed to talk about it. Rex just wants us to keep our ears open just in case we hear something. He figured that Ben and I would be in the best position to hear something since we know people there. Should I be offended that he didn't ask me? Asked Naomi. She was only half joking. Allie laughed. It's just because you're not officially in the pack. If you'd come to your senses, say yes, and officially join us, maybe you'd be able to join in on all the fun we have. Listen, if you and your man are any indications of the kind of fun you have, as official members of the pack, count me out. Naomi riposted. Allie gasped in mock outrage. Hey, we are very fun. Okay? Especially Ben and we're very exciting. Just the other night we finished off a bottle of wine and stayed up till midnight. The two women fell into uncontrolled fits of laughter at Allie's joke. Naomi felt much lighter as she talked to her best friend, the hovering worry in the back of her mind slightly making place for more cheerful thoughts. You're not worried about it, are you, Allie? Asked Naomi. You know, all of this is just rumors. There's nothing to say your father is going to make trouble. The man's too smart for that. But even as she reassured Allie, Naomi found herself doubting her words. She instantly tried to dismiss her oncoming anxiety. I'm not worried, I promise. It was just on my mind a little. But thankfully, I have my friend here to help me. Oh, and before I forget, you need to find a time that's good for you to have your fitting for your bridesmaid dress. It had been a long time since Naomi had even worn a dress. In her old life, she used to like dressing up, wearing makeup, and all of the things that girly girls love to do. But since she'd moved to the farm, her opportunities to wear something other than jeans, sweaters, and boots were limited. It would be fun to have a chance to get dressed up with her friend again. Alright, I'll check and let you know. I'm very busy around here, you know, so much mucking out and scolding the animals and weeding to do. Allie giggled. I gotta go. Ben's taking me to lunch. Naomi groaned in mock frustration. Fine. Tell him from me that I think he's dumb. You know you love him, Allie replied before she hung up the phone. They rarely said goodbye to each other on the phone. There didn't seem to be any need. It had started when they met as middle schoolers for some reason long since lost to time, but it was a tradition that Naomi appreciated. As soon as she got off the phone, the feelings of discomfort flooded back into her mind. She didn't know what it was, but there was something about the conversation they just had that was bothering her somewhere deep in her soul. She tried to think it through but nothing was coming up. Suddenly, she heard the sound of a car coming up the driveway. She jumped up and ran to open the front door expecting a customer. In the last few months, her customers started to become comfortable enough to come right to her door to ask her for what they needed, be that eggs, wool, or flowers. Naomi gasped when she saw the car. It was Rex's black SUV. He didn't usually come up to the farm. The last time he'd been there was the day he'd facilitated the sale of the farm to Naomi. He preferred to buy her wares in the store in town. Allie thought it was because it legitimized Naomi's farm as a business to the people living in Fell. She quickly retied her ponytail and brushed her hand down the front of her sweater. She didn't have time to change and she didn't really look at her best. At least not good enough to receive an alpha. But there wasn't much she could do about it. She watched the car come up to the house, thanking her past self for having the forethought to wash her hands and face when she'd come back in from feeding the animals and cleaning the barn. She couldn't do anything about any stray barn smells that might be clinging to her, but that was life. The car slowed down and stopped right in front of the house and Rex got out of the driver's seat. Naomi wasn't used to an alpha being so casual as to drive himself around. Her whole life she'd expected authority figures to exercise their power more explicitly. Rex was the opposite of the alphas she'd been used to, and even though she'd known him for a year now, she didn't know what to make of him. Her surprise doubled when the passenger door opened and Alan Green, one of the leading elders of Fell, hopped out. Alan had never been to her farm. When she first got to Fell, he'd been skeptical of her. Allie had both been and Rex to vouch for her, but Naomi, with her reluctance to pledge allegiance to the pack, and the fact that she wanted to live on her own on the edge of town, had been another story. The pack elders were reluctant to accept her, fearing it would mean inviting a spy into their midst, or even worse, spark an all-out war with Sanguine. Alan had been the one to preach patience to them, despite his own skepticism. "We do not know her yet," he'd said. He was the kind of man people listened to when he spoke, and he used his words to great effect. "Perhaps she is a spy. But she probably isn't. Even if the Sanguines come looking for her, our pack is in much better shape than theirs. And does that mean that we should rush headlong into every conflict we can find?" asked another elder. "Not, but it means that we are secure. Galkin is not stupid enough to attack us when he is so weak. It will take him years to rebuild. We have nothing to lose by welcoming her into our town." He had smiled at Naomi. "And we have everything to gain." She'd never forgotten that moment. She'd held him in high esteem ever since, even going so far as to personally deliver fresh vegetables and fruits to his house whenever she was in the neighborhood. Alan, for his part, had come to regard her with warmth, instead of the indifference and skepticism he'd had in the beginning. "Good morning, Naomi." Rex smiled and waved at her as they came up the stairs. Naomi shuddered to think of the mess she'd left on the coffee table. "Good morning, Rex, Mr. Green." For all of Rex's insistence on informality between his wolves, she still couldn't bring herself to call Alan by his first name. Seemed so disrespectful somehow. She shook hands with both men and held the door to welcome them inside. The afternoon sun was filling the house with a beautiful white golden glow. Naomi felt a rush of gratitude that she'd thought to put fresh flowers in the vase on the dining table. Having the alpha and one of his most esteemed elders in her house was more than a little nerve-wracking. She found herself running through everything she'd done in the last week or so like a kid called in by the principal. She cleared her throat. "I'm sorry, but did we have an appointment I forgot about?" "No. We were in the area and thought we'd pop in." "I hope we aren't interrupting anything," said Alan. "No, not at all. I'm glad you came. I don't get much company out here." She led both men to the couch and hurried to the kitchen to get coffee for everyone. Once they had settled with their cups of coffee, Naomi waited expectantly for Rex and Alan to tell her what they wanted from her. The men were silent for a while, sipping their coffee and looking at the other to start the conversation. Finally, Alan bit the bullet. "As you might suspect, there's something we'd like to discuss with you," he started. "It's about you joining our pack." Naomi's stomach dropped, and thoughts started racing through her head. Were they going to say that they didn't want her here anymore? "I'm sorry to put pressure on you like this," Alan continued, "but we think that now would be the right time for you to officially join us. Naomi looked from Rex to Alan. She got the feeling that there was something they weren't telling her. Why the rush? Rex and Alan looked at each other again before Rex spoke. I'm going to be honest. Some security concerns have been raised lately, and to be perfectly frank, you would be a lot safer if you were an official member of the pack. We can't protect you if something happens to you while you're out here as a loner. You know that. Naomi frowned. So Allie had been right. They were worried about something. What kind of security concerns? It's nothing you should worry about, said Alan. We just felt that for the good of everyone involved, we should make this arrangement official. Rex jumped in. I get why you're reluctant to do this. I do, believe me. Coming from where you're from, I wouldn't be surprised if you didn't want to join a pack ever again. He put his mug on the coffee table and leaned over to her. We've really loved having you here this past year. I mean, look what you did with this old farm. I don't think it produced a single thing for 5 years before you got here. But you know just as well as I do that we can only fully protect you if you're officially one of us. Otherwise, you're leaving yourself open to all kinds of danger. Naomi leaned back in her chair. Rex was right, of course. When wolves were threatened, they protected their pack above all else. And as long as she was a loner, she wasn't at the top of the pack's protection list in case of attack. She could even be a liability to them. But there was something else that was going on here. What had Rex and Alan so rattled? Was Allie right? Was Andre planning something with that man he hired? Alan put his cup on the coffee table. I understand why you're hesitant. And I apologize that we are putting pressure on you like this. But it's been a year. Naomi, you need to make a decision. It's in everyone's best interest. I know, Mr. Green. And I really appreciate your concern. It's just that the words dried up in her throat. There was no way that she could tell Alan Green the ins and outs of her decision to stay outside of the pack structure. I have reasons why I've been taking this long to make a decision, she said. Finally. I'm sorry we've just sprung this on you, Naomi, said Rex. But please, believe me, it's my job to do what's in everyone's best interest, and I think that now is the time to take this step. I honestly don't think it'll be worth the risk to delay this any longer. I get where you're coming from, but I still don't understand why there's such a rush. If something's wrong, please just tell me. It will help me to at least make an informed decision, she pleaded. And if it has something to do with Andre Galkin, perhaps I can help. I know things about the Sanguine Pack. The two men looked worriedly at each other. If there was something you needed to worry about, I'd let you know, said Rex. But I have to be honest, Naomi. You can't help us in the way you want to if you are not an official member of our pack. Naomi stayed silent as she mulled over what they'd said. There was something to their words. Security was something she'd been worried about ever since she moved out here. Loners were looked down upon in the werewolf community. They were considered untrustworthy and disloyal. If she joined the Fell Pack, the other wolves would regard her with more trust, and they would protect her in case it was needed. And Rex was right. The other elders would never accept her information about the Sanguine Pack if she wasn't an official member. Half of them still thought she was a spy for Andre. Please, can I just have another day to think about it? She asked. The men both nodded and stood up in unison. We should go. We interrupted your morning, said Rex as he drained the rest of his coffee and headed for the door. Alan hung back. Call me tomorrow with your decision. I hope you make the right decision, he said, patting her paternally on the shoulder before walking towards the door, Naomi following in his tracks. Look, there's nothing to be worried about, Rex said. We have everything under control. Just make sure to let us know in case you need anything. He gave her a slightly awkward side hug, which made her smile. They really were trying to make her feel welcome. She watched the car pull out of the drive and down to the main road, and for a moment she felt a twinge of melancholy. Part of her wanted to run after them and scream that she wanted to be a member of their pack and that she'd do anything they wanted. But another part of her wanted to retreat, to hide and not let them in, to protect herself from the hurt that would absolutely be waiting for her if she joined a pack again. A memory flashed through her mind of watching her father arguing with a man who looked to be twice his size, shouting about something that a 6-year-old Naomi couldn't even begin to comprehend. She'd been hiding at the top of the stairs in the little shadowy area that protected her from the view of anyone downstairs but let her watch the grown-ups to her heart's content. The man shouting at her father was the alpha of the Florida pack Naomi had been born into. The memory was patchy, but there were some things Naomi could recall with photographic detail. The man's look of burning rage, the sound of shattering ceramic as he broke a vase over her father's back, and the blood standing out red as sin on the pure white of the carpet that Naomi wasn't allowed to play on. Then everything went blank. No more memory. There was a reason why she tried not to think about the time before her family moved to Sanguine. The time afterwards hadn't been that great either, but at least she'd had friends to help her get through the worst parts. Naomi took a big breath and tried to get rid of the butterflies eating a tattoo in her stomach. She knew that there was more to her distrust of authority than just that one incident. It had built up over years and years of seeing the people she loved and looked up to being put through things that seemed unfair or just downright wrong. Years of watching her family and the families of her friends bend over backwards to protect and respect the traditions of their leaders who, in turn, saw them as disposable. But part of her knew that it wasn't fair to impose her experiences with corrupt leadership onto a pack like Fel. Rex's leadership style was like nothing she'd ever seen before. Maybe it wouldn't be too bad to fall in line behind him. He didn't seem like the sort of alpha who'd dictate what people should do with their lives. Naomi's head was starting to hurt, and she wanted to stop thinking about all of it. She just wanted to go inside, have another cup of hot chocolate, and take a nap. Her decision as to whether to join the pack would need to wait until tomorrow. Chapter 4. John. After Dimitri's meeting with Andre was over, John drove Dimitri back to the compound. The compound was on the very edge of the Sanguine village. It was a spacious, wooded area, providing lots of much-needed privacy from prying eyes. It also gave Dimitri the freedom he needed to train his people however he wanted, and punish them however he wanted too. At the back of the property was Dimitri's house. It was a large 3-story building with very little to commend it. Many of Dimitri's people had their own residences and families outside the compound, but John had lived at Dimitri's house ever since he first started working for him. John's room was on the top floor, in the wing opposite from Dimitri's. Just like the rest of the house, his room was sparsely furnished with just the essentials. There was a large brass bedstead with a slightly too firm mattress, and a single blanket, a chair, a table, and a closet. And that was it. Dimitri didn't see the need for any kind of personalization. It had been hard to get used to at first, but now John considered it home. Even so, he was keenly aware that this was not actually home. It was the place where he worked, the place that provided room and board on the job training, and fairly good pay, no matter how frightening it could be to work for. Dimitri, with his legendary bad temper, no one could deny that he remunerated his people very well. When John had first come to Dimitri's compound, he'd been a scared young boy, only 12 or 13 years old. He'd blocked out most of the memories from that time, and whatever he could still remember, he didn't return to very often. The first few months in Dimitri's compound had been confusing and painful, especially for a child that young. On his first night here, as he was driven up to the compound, his heart had been beating in his throat. No one would tell him exactly what was going to happen, but John was smart enough to know that it was nothing good. The car had driven up to the large wrought iron gates and pulled in, the house rising up in the distance like a block of granite. The compound had been empty, but even at that late hour the lights dotted about the fence lit it up almost to the level of daylight. Dimitri had been waiting for him on the steps to the house, watching the young boy with his steely-eyed gaze. John had walked up the stairs and stopped in front of the man who would be his new boss. Or was the right word owner? He had stood there waiting for something to happen, vaguely aware that there were people standing on the steps behind him waiting for the same thing. Dimitri had looked him over, his face never betraying a single thought. Finally he had broken out in a huge grin. "He will do quite nicely," he had said. John had heard the sound of the car pulling away, leaving John behind. The sound was quiet and distant, almost as though the car was intimidated by Dimitri too. Standing in front of this huge man, this huge wolf, this personified bogeyman with his wild eyes, John had felt completely lost for the first time in his life. It was a strange feeling not knowing what to do. In all the rest of his short life, John had taken charge of things like when he was playing with other kids. He had defended the weaker kids from the bullies, refereed all their games, and decided on the outcome of all those childish conflicts on the playground. But this here was different, and there was nothing he could do to change his fate. Dimitri had crouched down to his level. "Welcome to your new home, puppy," he had said. "As long as you listen to me and do exactly what I say, everything will be fine." He had patted John on the back hard enough to make him bend over a little, and disappeared into the house with a wave. John had followed, and closed the door on his life before. Driving through the darkness, his eyes on the road before him, John thought back to the scared boy he'd been before. He hadn't known it back then, but Dimitri had made it his task to push him so that he would make something of his life. He had provided him with discipline, guidance, and education, even hiring tutors to make sure John didn't fall behind in his schoolwork. He'd taught him everything: how to defend himself, how to take his advantages where he could, and how to force life to give him what he wanted even when it didn't seem like it was in the cards. John's first full moon had been with Dimitri and his team. It had been frightening and slightly painful and scary, exhilarating and freeing at the same time. He'd seen other wolves during the full moon, of course, but actually going through it himself was another experience altogether. As he lay on the ground in the woods, trying to wrap his head around what he'd just gone through, Dimitri had kneeled close to him. "We're not animals, puppy," he had said. "We're something greater than any of the living beings around us. You need to learn to control yourself. I will not tolerate this again." And true to his word, Dimitri had taught John to control his wolf side, to harness the energy and instincts that came with being a werewolf and use them to his advantage. John had blossomed under Dimitri's tutelage, turning into one of his best assets. It wasn't a bad life, all told. John was part of a team, small as it was. Dimitri liked to keep a small team of trusted people around him, for people he'd known for years. They looked out for each other and for their boss. It was like they had their own little pack within the Sanguine pack, their loyalty to their leader unquestionable, even when Dimitri's loyalty to them was nothing short of uncertain, and even when none of the team members actually knew all that much about Dimitri. All they knew was that they worked for the Alpha's greatest secret weapon. John had once asked Harry Gibbard, the oldest person on the team and the one who'd known Dimitri the longest, why Dimitri took young kids into his team. "That's how he likes it," Harry had explained. "That way he can teach you what he needs you to know right from the start. Train you right." And he had. Dimitri had planned a regimen to create his perfect enforcers. From the moment the boys stepped in the door, physical training, chores around the compound, and exercises, all designed to create the perfect soldiers. John was proud of the man he had become. He would do anything he had to do for the good of the team and the pack. He was excited to help Dimitri with a big job, to finally be a real part of the team, and to understand what it was that his boss did. But something about this job didn't sit right with him. Dimitri was not exactly a saint. John knew that better than anybody, but there had to be a line somewhere, didn't there? Whoever this woman was, she'd chosen to leave her pack and build a life elsewhere, away from Andre. And now, from what John had gathered, she was going to end up dead. John would never question Dimitri, of course, but a woman who was trying to make a life for herself was about to have her world irrevocably changed, because she was friends with the wrong person. If anything, Andre's words had confirmed that some of the rumors flying about might be accurate. Someone in Sanguine had once told John that Alexandra hadn't been brainwashed by the Fells and had instead taken the opportunity to leave her father's repressive ways with her childhood sweetheart. John had dismissed it offhand. No one in Sanguine would do something like that. But here he was being proven wrong. Someone had left the pack, choosing to be a loner of all things. It was a hard concept to grasp. Dimitri seemed to notice John's internal doubts. "Stop sulking, puppy," he said. "It's just a job." John didn't reply, settling for just a nod to his boss in the back seat. He had learned that no answer was the best answer in these cases. Dimitri expected his people to do whatever he ordered them to do, no matter their own misgivings, and John didn't want to give him a reason to get angry. So he swallowed down his doubts and kept driving. Whatever else he was a good soldier. When they finally made it back to the compound, John made his way up to his room and collapsed on the bed. He hadn't slept in a day and a half between checking and rechecking the meeting site and the adrenaline pumping through his body. He was completely spent, barely able to take off his clothes. He closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep. He needed rest if he was going to actually contribute to this job. No matter what, he was going to make Dimitri proud, even when this was going to be a hard job. Morning came sooner than expected. John felt the warmth of the first beams of sunlight falling right on his face. The lack of curtains on his window was a deliberate design on Dimitri's part. It ensured that John would be up at the crack of dawn. He got up and got dressed. He wore the same kind of outfit. Everyday black t-shirt, black sweater, black jeans, black boots. He went downstairs and ate breakfast alone in the kitchen, as he usually did. Dimitri had told him last night that he wanted to meet to discuss their game plan for the job, so John hurried up to Dimitri's wing, trying to time his steps so he'd be right on time. Not early, not late, but on time. Dimitri had a complete suite in the east wing to himself, with its own living room, bathroom, and even a small kitchenette. There was also a huge polished conference table in the middle of the living room where Dimitri would hold court with his team. John knocked twice, went inside, and sat in the second seat from the head of the table like he always did. He didn't have to wait for long. Dimitri stomped in from the balcony, a cigarette hanging from his lips. "Good morning, pup," he said. Even though John had been here for 15 years, he hadn't outgrown the nickname as much as he wanted to. It had become his moniker with everyone here, and he'd learned to let it go. "Andre's pup got me the details of the job this morning," said Dimitri. Sitting down at the head of the table, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and tossed it to John. The girl's address and the rest of the details about the route into town. Some of Andre's men already mapped it out for us. As Andre said, she's a loner, and there's no one else on the property. The Fells won't even notice. At least not until someone wants to buy an egg or something. Dimitri waved dismissively. John unfolded the paper and scanned the information. The woman Naomi lived on a farm on the edge of Fell, and sold her produce at the general store in town. Other than a few animals, she lived on the farm alone. She had ties to the Fell pack, but she hadn't officially joined them, decimating the chances that the Fells would mount a rescue attempt for her. There was a back path to the farm which would take them all the way around the outside of town so they wouldn't be seen. Once they were there, it was just a matter of incapacitating the target and bringing her back. It seemed like a fairly easy job. The only thing that might pose a problem was the alpha of the Fell pack, Rex Blake. Rumors about the man said he didn't care all that much about tradition, even going against the elders of his own pack to welcome outsiders into their ranks. If anyone got in the way of their work, it would be him. "What about Blake?" John asked. "It would make the job a lot easier if he were out of the way. If any alpha stuck their necks out for a loner, it would be him." Dimitri chuckled. "I'd love a chance at him, believe me. But it's an unnecessary complication. Andre's men say the girl's alone every night. Even so, I'll tell Andre to post some of his men around town to find out when Blake will be gone. At least then we can be assured of no obstacles." John nodded. "All right. I'll start getting the equipment ready and check the routes. That way we can go whenever we need to." Dimitri nodded. "Good. You're going to come with me when we retrieve her, and then you'll be responsible for guarding her at Andre's site. I want no mistakes. This job is just as important to us as it is to Andre." John's stomach clenched. It was one thing to kidnap someone and hand her over to someone who wanted her dead, but now he was going to have to guard her too? And why did Dimitri seem so worked up over this job? Dimitri noticed his hesitation. "I'm not asking you, puppy. I'm telling you. And make sure you do a good job. I don't want any complications on this job. Everything must go perfectly." He leaned forward. Dimitri was not a small man, and the motion put him almost right in front of John. "Do not make me regret giving you a chance to play with the big boys, puppy," he growled. John just nodded. He'd never seen Dimitri like this. Dimitri always completed the jobs he took with the greatest degree of accuracy possible, but he never got this worked up over any of them. He trusted that his team understood the consequences of failing him, so threats weren't part of his arsenal. He didn't threaten. He punished. John took another look at the piece of paper, memorized the details on it, and handed it back to Dimitri, before standing up to take his leave. "Dimitri, looked him up and down, his eyes taking in his protégé as if for the first time. And by the look on Dimitri's face, John had to think he wasn't happy with what he saw. "Don't let me down, John," Dimitri said, before nodding in dismissal. John left the room as quickly as he could. He wasn't about to stand there and wait to find out if he was actually responsible for his boss's foul mood. He headed down to the basement storage area where the weapons were kept and started trying to plan out what they would need. A rope, a couple of guns, but nothing too bulky. They needed to be in and out of there before anyone noticed that something was wrong. They needed to work with surgical precision. He pulled out the equipment they needed, tested the strength of the ropes, and cleaned the 2 handguns, one for him and one extra. Dimitri always took care of his own hardware, even when he was working with someone else from the team. Another piece of the mystery that was their boss. Organizing was like second nature to John, and truth be told, he did enjoy it, even if it was for a job like this. He lost himself in the counting, the polishing, and the packing. In his head, he went over the route he'd memorized again and again, trying to anticipate the kinds of challenges they might come across. He was going to repeat this exercise multiple times in the next few days until they had confirmation that Rex Blake was gone and they could go in. Once John had the route mapped out and the equipment polished, oiled, and ready, he went upstairs and changed into the clothes he'd set aside for working out, which, like his normal uniform, were all black. He changed his jeans and boots for track pants and sneakers, jogged outside, and started his daily workout routine, which Dimitri had drilled into him from the beginning. A sprint around the compound, drilling with the dummies in the yard, 1,000 sit-ups, 1,000 push-ups. On and on. He lost himself in the routine, feeling the burning and stretching of his muscles. In his head he repeated the mantra the team had beaten into him when he was a child. No weakness. No mistakes. The doubt started creeping in, but he caught himself doubting Dimitri wasn't his place. He was going to do this job and he was going to do it well. It was all in the training. Any kind of job was to be done with the minimum of fuss. After all, he was a very good soldier. No weakness. He started his routine all over again, running around the perimeter of the courtyard, his heart beating so hard that he wouldn't have been surprised to see a bruise on his chest. No weakness. No mistake.